Welcome to the science section of our ACT review. Over the next couple of weeks, we will be going over the format of the Science ACT, the types of passages and questions you might come across, and some tips and tricks to be the most successful. Let's start first by looking at what the actual test booklet is going to look like. Here's the first page of the science reasoning test on the ACT. Notice in the upper right and left-hand corners, there's the number 4. This indicates that it is the fourth and final section of the multiple choice portion of the ACT. And if you choose not to sit for the writing portion, this will be the last section that you will complete. Notice on the bottom it says, in the directions, you may not use a calculator on this test. This is because the test has very little actual calculations, and the calculations it does have, you'll be able to do in your head. This is what an actual passage looks like. At the beginning of every passage, you'll see a short paragraph that describes what the experiment is that you're looking at. Generally, they will be followed by tables, figures, or graphs, although not always. Some passages will be writing only. All of this will be followed by 5, 6, or 7 questions. This brings us to the all-important question: how much science do I actually need to know? And honestly, not much. There are only about 3 or 4 questions on the Science ACT that require prior content knowledge from the classes that you've taken, like biology, chemistry, physics, or geology. Most of the questions on the Science ACT are actually about scientific method and your ability to analyze the data that you're given. Let's talk about the basics of this section of the test. You'll have 35 minutes for this section, over which time you'll see 6 to 7 passages, for a grand total of 40 questions. That will give you about 5 minutes per passage. The great thing is that you don't need to do these passages in order. And as we move forward, I'll teach you about each passage and each type of question, and some tricks to help you determine where you should start when you get to this section of the ACT. Let's talk first about the 3 types of passages that you'll come across as you're going through this section of the ACT. The first type of passage is a data representation passage. In this passage, you'll be looking at one study and trying to analyze the data given. There are generally 3 passages on this section of the ACT that fall under the category of data representation. The second type of passage is a research summaries passage. In these passages, you'll look at an experiment that has multiple parts. For instance, you may look at the same experiment twice, where you change a variable between the first study and the second study. There are generally 2 to 3 passages of this type on this section of the ACT. The last type of passage is called a conflicting viewpoints passage. In this passage, you'll be comparing the viewpoints of 2 experts as they look at one study. There is only ever one passage of this type on the Science ACT. Here is an example of a data representation passage. Notice you see a small paragraph followed by one table, noting that you will only be looking at one particular set of data as you answer these questions. Here is an example of a research summary passage. Notice that you have Experiment 1 and Experiment 2, and that both experiments have their own data table looking at different variables. This is an example of a conflicting viewpoints passage. Notice you have a scientist 1 and a scientist 2. In these passages, both scientists will be speaking about one particular topic. However, their interpretation of the data will lead them to 2 different conclusions. Here, in this example, both scientists are talking about the Earth's magnetic field, but have varying opinions as to why the Earth has a magnetic field. You won't always see it listed as Scientist 1 and Scientist 2. You may sometimes see it listed under the names of experts in their particular field. For instance, Paleontologist 1 and Paleontologist 2, or Astronomer 1 and Astronomer 2. Within these 3 passages, you will come across 5 types of questions. The first few types that we look at, you'll see quite often. And the last 2 types that we look at, you won't see as frequently. However, they are still important towards improving our score on this section of the ACT. The first type of question is a details question. These are the easiest questions on the ACT. In these questions, you'll be asked to look for a specific point on the graph or in a chart to find the answer for these questions. The second type of question is a pattern question. In these questions, you will look at an entire data set, and you'll be asked to make predictions about a point that exists just beyond the data set or a point that exists between two of the given points in your data set. The third type of question is an inference question. In these questions, you'll be asked to look at all of the information and draw a conclusion based off of what you are seeing. Our fourth type of question is a scientific method question. In these questions, you'll be asked to consider how an experiment is designed and what are some appropriate changes that can be made in order to improve the data. Here is where we start to see fewer of these types of questions. You'll only see about 1 to 3 of these questions on any given ACT. The fifth and final question is a compare and contrast question. These are found only in the conflicting viewpoints section and are asking you to consider the viewpoints of two different scientists. This is an example of a details question. Notice that the question is asking what sample 3 is composed primarily of. If I go down to the table that it references, I should see that it is 35% clay and 40% silt. So my answer choice is B. These are the easiest questions to answer on the ACT, and there are plenty of them there. This is an example of a pattern question. In this question, you're given a set of data and asked to make a prediction about a point that lies outside of this set of data. This is an example of an inference question. Here, you are asked if there is enough information in the passage to support the conclusion given in the question. Here is an example of a scientific method question. Remember, you'll only see 1 to 3 of these questions on the actual ACT. Here, you're asked to evaluate whether or not a change in the data collection would be beneficial to a scientist. Last but not least, here is an example of the compare and contrast question. Remember, you will only see this on the conflicting viewpoints passage in the ACT, of which there is only one. Here, you're asked to consider the perspective of both paleontologists and decide what they would both likely agree on. As we move forward and work through practice passages, we will spend lots of time clarifying what type of passage we're looking at and what type of questions we're seeing on all of these passages. Lastly, let's talk about how many questions you need to get correct in order to get your desired score on this section of the ACT. Since each section is different, the number of questions correct that you need for your desired score varies. However, the ranges are all pretty similar. For instance, if you miss 3 questions, you should expect to score anywhere between 30 and 33. I would bank on a 32. Generally speaking, if you're trying to get a 25 on this section of the ACT, you can miss no more than 1 question per passage. Grading on this section of the ACT is a little bit more severe because so much of the information is found within the passage itself. However, as I said before, we'll spend the next couple of weeks going over the types of passages and the types of questions to make sure that we can get the best score possible on this section of the ACT. That's all for today. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at all the different ways that data can be presented to you and how to pull information out of these sets of data. Bye!